The morning sun hits the manicured lawn of a three-bedroom ranch in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee, illuminating a sold sign that appeared only hours after the listing went live. To the casual observer, this is simply the vibrant pulse of the American real estate market, a sign of health and desirability in a growing metropolitan area. But if you were to peel back the layers of public record, if you were to trace the wire transfer that secured this property not with a 30-year mortgage but with an instant cash settlement, you would find no family name on the deed. There is no young couple dreaming of a nursery, no retiree looking for a garden to tend, and no individual citizen claiming their stake in the promise of private property. Instead, you would find a limited liability company, a sanitized string of alphanumeric characters that leads back through a labyrinth of subsidiaries and holding companies to a glass tower in Manhattan. This house has not been sold to a person, it has been absorbed into a portfolio. It has been transformed from a shelter into a yield-bearing financial instrument, a transformation that is occurring silently, systematically, and aggressively on every street in America. This is not an anomaly, nor is it a temporary distortion caused by market fluctuations or post-pandemic adjustments. It is a calculated mathematical conquest of the most fundamental human need, shelter. The narrative you have been fed by the mainstream financial press suggests that housing prices are high because of a simple lack of supply, or perhaps because millennials are finally reaching their peak home-buying years. These are comfortable half-truths designed to obscure a much colder reality. We are witnessing the end of homeownership as the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth creation and the dawn of a new economic epoch that historians of the future may well describe as neo-feudalism. The entities orchestrating this shift are not merely buying houses. They are engineering a society where the concept of ownership is replaced by the concept of subscription, and where the American dream is rebranded as a monthly service fee paid to a landlord that never sleeps, never negotiates, and answers only to the dictates of a quarterly earnings report. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we must look beyond the localized anecdotes of bidding wars and look at the aggregate data that paints a terrifying picture of consolidation. According to data from Redfin and the National Association of Realtors, in the fourth quarter of 2021 alone, investors bought 18.4% of all homes sold in the United States. In specific markets like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Phoenix, that number surged to over 30%. But even these staggering figures fail to capture the full scope of the strategy. These institutional behemoths are not buying random properties. They are targeting the specific inventory that serves as the entry point for the American middle class. Starter homes, they are purchasing the very rung on the ladder that allows a family to climb out of the precariousness of renting and into the stability of equity. By removing these specific assets from the market, they are not just investing in real estate. They are severing the mechanism of social mobility itself. The architects of this plan, giants like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and the private equity titans like Blackstone, are operating on a timeline that far exceeds the lifespan of a political cycle or a human generation. They are playing a game of monopoly where they have started with infinite liquidity, provided by the very central banks that are tasked with maintaining economic stability. This is not a conspiracy theory born in the dark corners of the internet. It is a business model openly celebrated in shareholder letters and investment prospectuses. In their view, the future of humanity is not a collection of sovereign individuals owning their own plot of land, but a fluid, mobile workforce of users who rent their existence. They have identified a structural flaw in the global economy, the inability of wages to keep pace with asset inflation, and they have decided to monetize the decline. They are betting against you. They are betting that you will never be able to save enough for a down payment, and they are ensuring that their bet pays off by driving the price of that down payment perpetually out of reach. Consider the implications of a report released by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University in 2023. Which noted that the price-to-income ratio for homeownership has reached levels not seen since the prelude to the Great Depression. However, unlike the 1920s, today's market is not being driven by irrational individual exuberance, but by rational institutional accumulation. When a family bids on a house, they are limited by their income, their credit score, and interest rates. When an institutional fund bids on a house, they are limited only by their access to capital markets, which, for the last decade, has been effectively unlimited and virtually free. This asymmetry creates a market failure of catastrophic proportions. It is a gunfight where one side has a musket and the other has a drone strike. The result is a foreclosure of the future, a systematic transferring of the nation's housing stock from the hands of the many into the portfolios of the few, creating a permanent renter class whose labor creates equity, not for themselves but for a faceless algorithmic landlord. To fully grasp the mechanics of this great dispossession, we must travel back in time, not just to the housing crash of 2008, but centuries further, to the Enclosure Acts of England in the 18th and 19th centuries. Before the Industrial Revolution could fully take hold, the common lands areas where the peasantry could graze livestock and grow food for subsistence had to be seized and privatized. The parliamentary acts that authorized these seizures were framed as necessary modernization, a way to increase agricultural efficiency and feed a growing nation. The result, however, was the destruction of rural independence and the creation of a desperate, landless urban proletariat who had no choice but to sell their labor in the factories of Manchester and Birmingham for subsistence wages. The parallel to our current moment is chillingly precise. Today, the commons is the accessible housing market, and the enclosure is being enacted not by parliamentary decree, but by capital allocation. The objective remains the same: to strip the population of their independence and force them into a dependency relationship with the owners of capital. The modern iteration of this enclosure began in earnest in the wreckage of the 2008 global financial crisis. While millions of Americans were watching their net worth evaporate and receiving foreclosure notices, a quiet revolution was taking place in the backrooms of Washington and Wall Street. In 2012, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, acting as the conservator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, launched a pilot program that allowed investors to purchase foreclosed homes in bulk. The government explicitly paved the way for the institutionalization of the single-family rental market. It was a fire sale of American sovereignty, justified by the desperate need to stabilize home prices. Warren Buffett, the so-called Oracle of Omaha, stated on CNBC in 2012 that if he would buy up a couple 100,000 single-family homes. The smart money saw the blood in the streets and realized that the American dream was distressed inventory. Enter Blackstone, distinct from BlackRock, though part of the same symbiotic ecosystem of high finance which formed Invitation Homes to execute this strategy on an industrial scale. Between 2012 and 2016, Invitation Homes spent approximately $10 billion purchasing nearly 50,000 homes. They sent teams to courthouse auctions with duffel bags of cashier's checks, outbidding everyone. But the crucial innovation wasn't just the buying, it was the operational efficiency. They treated houses not as unique structures requiring care, but as standardized units of yield. They developed sophisticated software to manage maintenance, rent collection, and evictions remotely. This marked the birth of the single-family rental asset class, or SFR. Before this moment, being a landlord was a local, fragmented business. After this moment, it became a tradable security, a line item on a pension fund's balance sheet, sanitized of the messy human reality of eviction and displacement. The fuel for this engine was provided by the Federal Reserve. For over a decade following the 2008 crisis, the Fed maintained a zero-interest rate policy (ZIRP) and engaged in quantitative easing, purchasing trillions of dollars in bonds and mortgage-backed securities. This flood of artificial liquidity crushed yields on traditional safe assets like government bonds, pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds, desperate for returns to meet their obligations, looked at the yield on a 10-year Treasury note hovering near historic lows and then looked at the potential yield from renting houses to a trapped American populace. The choice was mathematically obvious. The Federal Reserve, in its attempt to save the economy, effectively subsidized the hostile takeover of the American neighborhood. They made capital cheap for the giants while tightening lending standards for the little guy. This dynamic created a feedback loop that is now self-perpetuating. As institutional money poured into the housing market, prices rose. As prices rose, more individuals were priced out of ownership and forced into the rental market. As the demand for rentals increased, rents rose. As rents rose, the yield on owning rental properties increased, attracting even more institutional capital. In a report titled The Financialization of Housing, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing described this phenomenon as the transformation of housing into a financial asset first and a social good second. The global financial system has found a way to mine the very existence of human beings, charging them for the space they occupy on the planet with the price set not by local supply and demand, but by the yield requirements of a global investment portfolio. We must also scrutinize the role of BlackRock specifically, the world's largest asset manager, which oversees some $10 trillion in assets. While BlackRock often deflects criticism by claiming they do not buy individual houses in the same way Blackstone's Invitation Homes does, this is a distinction without a difference in the grand scheme of economic power. BlackRock is a major shareholder in the home builders like D.R. Horton and Lennar, and a major shareholder in the single-family rental REIT, real estate investment trusts that do the buy-in. They provide the capital plumbing that allows this system to function. Moreover, BlackRock's Aladdin risk management system, which oversees a staggering portion of the world's financial assets, helps direct the flow of capital toward sectors with stable, inflation-adjusted returns. In an inflationary environment, residential real estate is the ultimate hedge. By investing in the companies that build the homes and the companies that buy the homes to rent them out, BlackRock is effectively betting on the usership model of society. They are funding the transition to a world where you own nothing and you will be happier at least. You will pay your rent on time because the alternative is homelessness. The scale of this operation requires a level of detachment that is chilling to contemplate. When a local landlord raises the rent, they have to look you in the eye. They might know your children. They might know you lost your job. There is a social friction that moderates pure greed. But when the landlord is a faceless entity represented by a property management app, there is no negotiation. The algorithm determines the market rate based on real-time data from thousands of other units. If the algorithm says the rent should go up 20%, the email is sent automatically. In 2022, during the height of the post-pandemic inflation, stories emerged from cities like Tampa and Jacksonville of rents spiking by 30 or 40% overnight. This was not inflation in the traditional sense of devalued currency. It was the flexing of pricing power by an oligopoly that had cornered the market on survival. Furthermore, we must address the build-to-rent phenomenon, the latest evolution of this strategy. Seeing that buying existing homes was becoming politically sensitive and inventory was getting tight, institutions began partnering directly with home builders to construct entire subdivisions intended solely for renting. Imagine driving through a brand new neighborhood, pristine lawns, new playgrounds, fresh paint, but not a single person living there owns their home. The entire community is owned by a single fund. This is the recreation of the company town, but without the company job. You don't work for the landlord, you just exist to pay them. The builders love it because they can sell the entire subdivision in one transaction to a fund, eliminating the risk and time of selling to individuals. The fund loves it because they get brand new assets with low maintenance costs. The only loser is the American family, for whom the supply of purchasable homes has just been artificially restricted yet again. We are currently living through the intersection of two powerful engines that are crushing the independent homeowner. The first engine is the lock-in effect created by the Federal Reserve's rapid interest rate hikes starting in 2022. By raising rates from near zero to over 5% in a historically short period, the Fed has frozen the housing market. Homeowners who locked in 30-year mortgages at 3% are mathematically forbidden from selling. To sell and move would mean taking on a new mortgage at 7 or 8%. Doubling their monthly payments for the same value of house. This has caused inventory to plummet to historic lows. Into this vacuum steps the institutional buyer. High interest rates hurt individual buyers who need mortgages, but they hurt cash-rich institutions far less. In fact, in some perverse ways, high rates help the institutions by eliminating their competition. When a regular family cannot get a loan or cannot afford the monthly payment, the cash buyer is the only one left at the table. We are seeing a consolidation phase where the market is being cleared of retail participants. The institutions are playing the long game. They know that eventually, rates will normalize, or rents will rise enough to justify the purchase price. They have the capital to wait. You do not. They are acquiring assets in a paralyzed market, effectively cornering the supply while everyone else is on the sidelines. The second engine is the weaponization of data and technology. We must discuss the role of companies like RealPage, a software provider accused in multiple lawsuits and by the Department of Justice of helping landlords coordinate rental prices in a way that would be illegal if done in a smoke-filled room. The software collects private lease data from landlords' data that competitors usually would unsee and feeds it into an algorithm that recommends daily pricing. The algorithm almost always pushes for higher rents, prioritizing revenue over occupancy. It encourages landlords to keep units empty rather than lower the price, artificially restricting supply to boost the market rate. This is the digital cartelization of housing. When BlackRock or Vanguard-owned entities utilize these tools, they are not guessing what the market will bear. They are dictating what the market will bear. This convergence creates a scenario where the market price is no longer a discovery mechanism between a willing buyer and a willing seller, but a dictated value imposed by a monopoly power. The implications for the social contract are profound. If you cannot own property, you cannot build intergenerational wealth. If you cannot build intergenerational wealth, your children start from zero, or worse, from debt. This creates a permanent underclass that is vulnerable to every whim of the economic cycle. We are seeing the return of the patrimonial capitalism described by economist Thomas Piketty, where the return on capital exceeds the return on labor. But it is worse than Piketty imagined, because the asset being monopolized is not just capital in the abstract, but the physical roofs over our heads. Let us look at a case study: the Sun Belt migration. During the pandemic, millions of Americans moved to states like Texas, Florida, and Tennessee. They were chasing affordability and freedom. The institutions saw this data in real time. They saw the U-Haul rental data, the credit card swipes, the LinkedIn job updates. They moved ahead of the migration. In 2021, in some zip codes in Tarrant County, Texas, institutional investors purchased 52% of the homes sold. Think about that number, more than half. By the time the family from California or New York arrived, ready to bid, the game was already over. The institutions had front-run the American migration. They bought the dip in human geography. This is not efficient market theory. This is predation. The contrarian position here is to recognize that the coming crash in commercial real estate, or the potential recession everyone talks about, will not save the aspiring homeowner. In fact, a recession is exactly what the institutions are waiting for. If the economy falters and people lose their jobs, foreclosures will rise. Who will have the liquidity to buy those foreclosed homes? Not the unemployed worker. It will be the funds. A recession will function as a consolidation event, a harvesting of the remaining independent assets. Just as the 2008 crisis birthed the industry, the next crisis will mature it. They are holding dry powder billions in unallocated capital waiting for the distress signal. They are not afraid of the crash. They are the vultures circling the dying beast of the middle class, waiting to pick the bones clean. Furthermore, we must understand the geopolitical dimension. As the US dollar hegemony wobbles and inflation becomes a structural feature of the global economy due to deglobalization and debt monetization, the smartest money in the world wants out of paper assets and into real assets. A house is a real asset. It is made of lumber, copper, concrete, and land. It cannot be printed by a central bank. By converting fiat currency into American soil, these global funds are hedging against the collapse of the very monetary system that enriched them. They are trading illusion for reality, leaving the public holding the devaluing currency while they hold the tangible earth. This is the ultimate hedge, owning the ground beneath the feet of the population that generates the GDP. The trajectory we are on leads to a destination that is philosophical as much as it is economic. We are returning to a structure that humanity has known for most of its history, a structure that the anomaly of the 20th century American middle class briefly disrupted. We are returning to a world of lords and serfs, though we will use cleaner, softer language to describe it. We will call it the subscription economy, housing as a service, or asset-light living. But the power dynamic remains ancient. To own property is to have a sanctuary, a domain where the will of the state and the corporation must stop at the threshold. To rent is to live by permission. When that permission is granted by a monolithic entity with the legal and financial resources of a nation-state, liberty becomes a conditional privilege, revocable upon non-payment or violation of the terms of service. The stakes could not be higher. We are talking about the dissolution of the civic fabric. A community of owners cares about the local school board, the pothole on the corner, the safety of the park, because they have equity in the outcome. A community of transient renters, managed by a remote algorithm, has no such anchor. The social capital erodes alongside the financial capital. We are engineering a society of rootless drifters, moving from one corporate-owned box to another, never putting down the deep roots that are necessary for a stable democracy. The tenant class is not just an economic demographic, it is a political vulnerability. A population that owns nothing is a population that can be easily manipulated, easily silenced, and easily controlled. The time horizon for this transformation is not 50 years away, it is the next 10. The consolidation is happening exponentially. Every day that interest rates remain high, the lock-in effect deepens, and the institutional advantage grows. Every time a starter home is bought by a fund, it leaves the resale market forever. It enters the Roach Motel of institutional ownership, capital checks in, but the deed never checks out. We are approaching a tipping point where in major American cities the majority of the housing stock will be owned by entities that do not vote, do not send children to school, and do not care about the quality of life, only the quantity of rent. This is not a call to despair, but a call to a cold, hard awareness. The call to awareness here is to understand that the rules of the game have been rewritten without your consent. The strategy of save cash, wait for the crash, buy a house, is a strategy designed for a market that no longer exists. The market is now a battlefield of liquidity. Understanding this means realizing that you are not competing with your neighbor. You are competing with the combined balance sheet of the global financial system. It requires new strategies. It requires looking at markets where the institutions are, not perhaps rural areas, fixer-uppers that don't fit the algorithmic buy box, or building your own. It requires political action to demand restrictions on bulk ownership of single-family homes. A movement that is beginning to flicker in the halls of Congress, but is currently smothered by the lobbying power of the real estate industry. But more than anything, it requires a shift in mindset. You must stop viewing housing merely as a consumer good, and start viewing it as the front line of a war for personal sovereignty. The narrative that renting is freedom is a psychological operation designed to make you comfortable with your own dispossession. Resistance begins with rejecting the convenience of the subscription. It begins with understanding that the struggle to own a piece of the earth is the struggle for freedom itself. The door is closing, and the lock is turning, but for the first time in this long, dark history, you finally see who is holding the key. The invisible hand has been revealed as an iron fist in a velvet glove, grasping for the deed to your future. The question is no longer just about whether you can afford a house. It is about whether you can afford to live in a world where you don't. The ledger is open, the ink is drying, and the names being written are not yours. But knowledge is the only weapon that can pry that door back open, if only just enough to slip your foot in before it shuts forever. To understand the mechanics of this silent coup, we must descend from the high-altitude view of asset. allocation into the granular digital trenches where the price of your shelter is actually determined. For decades, the rental market was the definition of a fragmented, inefficient marketplace. A landlord in Phoenix did not know what a landlord in Tampa was charging, nor did they coordinate with a landlord across the street. Prices were discovered through the messy, human process of negotiation, vacancy rates, and local incomes. That inefficiency was the tenant's only protection. It meant that if one landlord got too greedy, the market would punish them with a vacancy. But that protection has been dismantled, not by legislation, but by a piece of software that has effectively unionized the landlords while leaving the tenants to fight alone. The weapon in question is known as YieldStar, a product of the company ReUpage. To the uninitiated, it looks like a boring property management tool, a spreadsheet with a better interface. But as revealed in a landmark investigation by ProPublica in late 2022, and subsequently targeted by the Department of Justice in a massive antitrust lawsuit, this software functions as a digital cartel. In a traditional competitive market, competitors are legally forbidden from calling each other to agree on prices. That is a felony. But RealPage found a loophole. If everyone sends their private data to a third-party algorithm, and that algorithm tells everyone to raise prices simultaneously, is it still conspiracy? The result is a system where the invisible hand of the market has been replaced by a digital fist. The software's algorithm, fed by real-time lease data from millions of units, often prioritizes pushing rents higher, even if it means leaving units empty. It has mathematically calculated that it is more profitable for a landlord to have 90% occupancy at a significantly higher rent than 100% occupancy at a fair market rate. This artificially restricts supply, creating a phantom scarcity that drives prices up for everyone, regardless of whether their specific landlord uses the software or not. This algorithmic price fixing creates a phenomenon that economists call herd immunity to market forces. In 2023, even as some supply chains normalized and inflation in other sectors cooled, shelter inflation remains stubbornly high. Why? Because the algorithm never sleeps, and it never feels pity. It does not care that your wages have stagnated. It simply looks at the aggregate data of the cartel and determines that the market can bear another 5% hike. A leasing agent in Seattle told investigators that before the software, they would hesitate to raise rents on good tenants. After the software, they said, we just follow the screen. The human element, the empathy, the negotiation, the long-term relationship has been exorcised from the transaction. You are no longer negotiating with a person. You are negotiating with a server farm in Texas that has decided your disposable income is an inefficiency to be eliminated, but the software is merely the tactical weapon. The strategic imperative comes from the financialization of the rental income itself. We must look at the dark magic of rental-backed securities. If you recall the 2008 crisis, the villain was the mortgage-backed security, MBS, where thousands of risky home loans were bundled together and sold to investors as safe bonds. The collapse happened because the homeowners couldn't pay. Wall Street has learned from this. They have pivoted to a new instrument, the single-family rental, SFR bond. In this structure, the underlying asset is not the mortgage payment, but your rent check. Companies like Invitation Homes and American Homes for Rent bundle thousands of leases into a bond and sell it to pension funds and insurance companies. This transformation is profound. When a home is owned by a family, it is a shelter. When it is owned by a fund and securitized, it is a yield-bearing bond. The investors who buy these bonds, often the very pension funds that represent the workers being priced out of housing, demand a specific, predictable return. If the bond promises a 4% yield, the rental income must cover that. This creates a structural floor for rents. Rents cannot go down, because if they do, the bond defaults. The financial system has effectively capitalized the future earnings of the American tenant class. They have sold your future rent checks to investors today. This creates an immense pressure on the corporate landlords to increase rents aggressively, not just to make a profit, but to service the debt that allowed them to buy the houses in the first place. It is a Ponzi scheme where the new capital coming in is your monthly paycheck. Now, let us overlay the macroeconomic engine, one of our convergence thesis, the Federal Reserve's interest rate trap. We are currently witnessing the greatest bifurcation in the history of the U.S. housing market. On one side, we have the locked-in homeowners. According to FHFA data, over 80% of outstanding U.S. mortgages have an interest rate below 5%, and a staggering amount are below 3%. These homeowners are effectively frozen in carbonite. They cannot sell. If a family living in a 3% mortgage house in Ohio gets a job offer in Florida, they run the numbers and realize that swapping their current mortgage for a new one at 7% would double their housing costs for a smaller home. So, they don't move. They turn down the job. They renovate the basement. They stay put. This lack of mobility has decimated the resale inventory. The National Association of Realtors reported that existing home sales dropped to levels not seen since 1995, but the population has grown by 70 million people since 1995. The demand is there. The supply is locked in a golden cage of cheap debt. This is where the institutional predator thrives. The institutions do not need a mortgage. They have lines of credit and cash reserves. When a desperate seller does appear due to divorce, death, or default, the institution is there with an all-cash offer that closes in 10 days. The retail buyer, struggling to get a pre-approval letter for a 7% loan, never even gets a showing. The high interest rate environment, which was ostensibly designed to cool the market, has paradoxically made it hotter for the entities that don't need to borrow, while freezing out the working class that does. The Fed has inadvertently cleared the playing field for the cash rich. Then we have Engine 2, the collapse of the supply chain for new entry-level homes. For the last decade, homebuilders have ceased building the 1,200 square foot starter home. The economics simply do not work. Land costs, regulatory hurdles, and material inflation mean that a builder loses money on a small house. They only build large, luxury McMansions or high-density apartments. This leaves a gaping hole in the market where the first-time homebuyer used to exist. The institutions have identified this void. They are now engaging in build-to-rent BTR contracts, where they pay builders to construct entire neighborhoods of starter homes that will never be listed for sale. Drive through the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, or Atlanta, Georgia. You will see rows of sparkling new cottages, perfect for a young family. You might pull over, thinking you've found a hidden gem, but there is no sales office. There is only a leasing office. These homes were captured before the foundation was even poured. The builders have become subcontractors for the landlord regime. They have realized that selling to BlackRock is easier than selling to the public. BlackRock doesn't complain about the paint color. BlackRock doesn't fail financing at the last minute. This BTR trend is the final nail in the coffin of inventory. It ensures that the new supply coming online bypasses the ownership market entirely and flows directly into the rental pool. We are not just running out of existing homes, we are privatizing the production of future homes. The convergence of these forces creates a perfect storm that is visible in the data of cities like Charlotte, North Carolina. In 2022 and 2023, despite a cooling national market, Wall Street landlords in Charlotte continued to acquire properties aggressively. Why Charlotte? Because it represents the banking hub of the South, a place with net migration and high-paying jobs. The algorithm identified it as a high-yield zone. A report by the University of North Carolina Charlotte found that in some Mecklenburg County neighborhoods, 95% of single-family rental homes are owned by corporations. 95%. In those zip codes, the concept of a neighborhood has been fundamentally altered. It is no longer a civic entity. It is a dormitory for workers who service the banking sector. The wealth generated by these workers does not stay in Charlotte to build local businesses or improve local schools. It is siphoned off instantly to shareholders in New York, London, and Tokyo. It is colonial extraction disguised as property management. This brings us to the most disturbing realization of the investigative phase: the complicity of the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These organizations were created to promote homeownership, yet in recent years, they have backed multi-billion-dollar loans to institutional landlords. In 2017, Fannie Mae guaranteed a $1 billion loan to Invitation Homes. The taxpayer, through these government agencies, is effectively subsidizing the competition that is crushing them. We are underwriting our own displacement. When you pay your taxes, you are funding the cheap leverage that allows a hedge fund to outbid you for a house. It is a perversion of the mandate so complete that it would be comical if it were unso tragic. The two engines framework, macro constraints and industrial demand, reveals that we are in the early innings of a structural shift, not a cyclical bubble. The bubble bursting is the plan. The institutions know that the current valuations are stretched. They are waiting for the inevitable recession to flush out the last of the weak. Hence the Airbnb hosts who are overleveraged, the flippers who got caught holding the bag, and the families living paycheck to paycheck. When that flush happens, likely within the next 18 to 24 months as the lag effects of monetary policy hit, the transfer of wealth will accelerate. The cash on the sidelines that financial TV pundits love to talk about is not waiting to save the stock market. It is waiting to buy your neighborhood at a 30% discount. We are witnessing the industrialization of the American dream. Just as agriculture was industrialized in the 20th century, moving from family farms to massive corporate conglomerates, housing is undergoing the same transition. The efficiency gains are real. Corporate landlords can fix a roof cheaper than you can, but the social cost is the elimination of the yeoman class. The independent homeowner, the bedrock of the republic, is being replaced by the dependent tenant, and unlike the serfdom of the Middle Ages, which was bound by tradition and occasionally by mutual obligation, this new serfdom is bound by the cold, binary logic of a contract and enforced by the swift, unfeeling efficiency of the digital court. But to truly understand where this leads, we must look beyond the economics and into the philosophy of control. The ultimate goal is not just rent, it is data. A smart home, rented from a tech-forward institutional landlord, is a data mine. They know when you are home, how much energy you use, when you pay, and who visits. This data is valuable. In the next phase, your housing subscription will likely be bundled with other services: internet, insurance, Food delivery, creating a total ecosystem of dependency. You will not just live in their house. You will live in their operating system. The convergence is the point where physical shelter becomes just another app on your phone, a service you subscribe to, with terms and conditions that you scroll past and click agree because you have nowhere else to go. The final destination of this trajectory is not merely a change in the line items of a household budget, but a fundamental rewriting of the social contract that has governed Western civilization since the Enlightenment. We are drifting toward a state of neo-feudalism, a term that sounds hyperbolic until you strip away the technological veneer and examine the power dynamics beneath. In the feudal system, the vast majority of the population lived on land they did not own, working to pay a portion of their yield to a lord who provided protection. Today, the lord is a conglomerate of pension funds and asset managers. The protection is the maintenance of the roof and the Wi-Fi connection, and the yield is approximately 40% of your monthly income. The difference is that the medieval serf knew he was a serf. The modern tenant is told he is a valued customer enjoying the flexibility of the gig economy. This rebranding of dispossession as flexibility is perhaps the greatest marketing triumph of the 21st century. It convinces the victim that their lack of equity is actually a lifestyle choice, a freedom from the burdens of ownership, when in reality it is a freedom from the possibility of wealth. Consider the psychological toll of a society where the majority of the population lives in a state of permanent transience. Homeownership has historically been the primary driver of civic engagement and community stability. When you own a home, you plant trees that you may not sit under for 20 years. You care about the quality of the local school even after your children have graduated because it affects your property value. You are anchored. In a rentership society, this horizon creates a culture of the ephemeral. Why plant a tree if your lease is up in 12 months? Why fight for the neighborhood if the algorithm might raise your rent by 30% next year, forcing you to move to a cheaper zip code? We are engineering a rootless population, a nation of nomads wandering from one corporate-owned box to another, their connections to their neighbors as shallow as their tenure in the unit. This fragmentation serves the interests of the ruling class perfectly. A transient, disconnected population is far harder to organize politically than a community of entrenched, property-owning citizens. The timeline for this total transformation is shorter than most realize. We are looking at a 10-year horizon where the window of opportunity for the average earner to acquire capital assets will effectively close. The World Economic Forum's infamous prediction, "You will own nothing, and you will be happy," was not a command, but a forecast based on these very trend lines. By 2035, if current acquisition rates continue, the single-family home in a major, metropolitan area will be a luxury good akin to a private plane or a concatenation of fine art accessible only to the ultra-wealthy and the sovereign wealth funds. The middle class will be bifurcated into a small upper tier that managed to inherit property or buy before the door slammed shut, and a vast lower tier that subscribes to life. You will subscribe to your housing, your transportation, your entertainment, and your food delivery. You will be a conduit for cash flow, passing money from your employer directly to the asset owners, retaining almost nothing for yourself. This is the velocity of money weaponized against the saver. This shift also exposes the deep hypocrisy of the environmental narrative, often espoused by these same institutions. We are told that high-density, rental living is greener, that the suburban lifestyle is unsustainable. Yet, observe what the elites are buying with their own personal capital. They are buying ranches in Montana, islands in the Pacific, and estates in New Zealand. They are acquiring massive tracts of land, water rights, and productive farmland. They understand that in a world of digital illusions and fiat currency degradation, the only true wealth is the physical earth and what it can produce. They preach density for you while they accumulate acreage for themselves. They are hedging against the very fragility they have introduced into the system. While you are being herded into a metaverse of digital assets and rental contracts, they are fortifying their positions in the real world. The metaverse is for the tenant. The universe is for the landlord. The call to awareness, therefore, is not a simple investment tip. It is a plea to recognize the game board for what it is. The traditional financial advice: diversify your 401k, buy a few ETFs, wait for 65 is advice for a world that is being dismantled. If you want to escape the trap, you must prioritize the acquisition of unencumbered real assets above all else. This might mean leaving the hot cities where the institutions are hunting. It might mean moving to the Rust Belt, the rural Midwest, or areas that the algorithms deem low growth and therefore leave alone. It implies a sacrifice of lifestyle today for sovereignty tomorrow. It means understanding that a mortgage, while a debt, is a fixed-cost hedge against a future of spiraling rent inflation. It is the only way to lock in your housing costs for 30 years while the rest of the world faces an annual struggle against the pricing power of the cartel. Furthermore, this requires a political awakening. The anger that is currently directed at cultural issues or partisan distractions is energy that is being siphoned away from the only war that truly matters: the war between capital and labor for control of the physical world. There must be a demand for legislative barriers to institutional ownership. We have antitrust laws for oil, for tech, for telecommunications. Why do we not have antitrust laws for the accumulation of single-family homes? Why is a hedge fund allowed to buy 10,000 houses in a single city, effectively cornering the market on survival? Until the population recognizes this, not as the free market, but as market manipulation, the consolidation will continue unchecked. The invisible hand does not exist when one player has all the chips and can see everyone else's cards. As the sun sets on that manicured lawn in Nashville, the sold sign is taken down, replaced not by a family's nameplate, but by a for rent sign with a QR code and a corporate logo. The lights inside flip on, controlled by a smart hub connected to a central server. A young couple drives by, slows down, looks at the house with a mix of longing and resignation, and then drives on to their apartment complex. They do not know that the house was sold before it ever hit the market. They do not know about the algorithm that set the rent price they are about to pay. They only know that the ladder feels slippery, that the rungs are getting further apart. But you now see the wires, the transfers, the strategic intent. The enclosure is almost complete, but the gate is not yet locked. The act of buying a home, of claiming a piece of the earth, is no longer just a financial decision. It is an act of rebellion. It is a declaration that you will not be a serf in the kingdom of capital. It is the planting of a flag in the soil of your own future, a refusal to be moved, a refusal to be subscribed, and a refusal to be erased. The war for the American home is over. The war for the American homeowner has just begun.